All right, let us continue. Raise those hands if you can hear me. All right, that's good enough. That is good enough. No. All right, so we looked at the movement of blood within the heart. There's another component that you need to be aware of, the rhythmic contraction of the heart in terms of how it's created from electrical current. We won't be covering that now, but when we cover cardiovascular emergencies, I will teach you that one, right? Gonna teach you the Dudus principle at that point. So let us continue. Let me get rid of this pointer. All right, the heart, hollow muscular organ that is approximately the size of an adult's clenched fist, made up of specialized cardiac muscle. Works as two paired pumps. The septum divides the right and left side. The right side is responsible for receiving and distributing deoxygenated blood. The left side is responsible for receiving and distributing oxygenated blood. Each side is divided into upper chamber and a lower chamber. The upper chamber is the atrium. The lower chamber is the ventricle. Circulation. The heart receives its blood from the aorta via the coronary arteries. The right side receives deoxygenated blood from the veins, and the left side receives oxygenated blood from the lungs. Now, a normal resting heart rate for an adult is 60 to 100 beats per minute. And the younger the patient is, the faster the heart rate will be. And we'll go into how you can calculate that down the line. Now, stroke volume is the amount of blood that is moved with each beat of the heart. Cardiac output is the amount of blood moved in 1 minute, and that's the heart rate times the stroke volume. And that basically is going to give us a blood pressure. Now, what you need to understand is that it's a muscle. Now, the more conditioned the muscle is, the more effective it will be in how it works. So if a individual is athletic, so they're training for track and field, they do a lot of play a lot of football or aerobic type activities, their heart muscle develops over time, so they get a decent heart muscle. Now, once the heart muscle is well developed, it will stretch further, so it can stretch to a further distance. The greater the ability of the heart to stretch, the more blood can come into the heart, and the stronger the contraction will be to push blood where it needs to go. Now, what that also means is if there is greater stretch, it means the contraction will be slower, right? So if there is greater distance in that stretch, the contraction is going to be slow. So basically what that means is a person that is conditioned, in good shape, athletic, football player, these individuals will have a pulse rate or a heart rate that is below 60, and it is perfectly normal for them, right? Because of how well conditioned the heart muscle is. Now, the electrical conduction system, not going to go into details with it right now, but just understand that in order for us to get a rhythmic contraction from the heart, it comes from electrical stimulation and the movement of electrolytes. So electrical conduction system causes smooth coordinated contractions, and the contractions produce pumping action. Now, the arteries. Arteries carry blood from the heart to all body tissues. The aorta, which is the largest artery in the body, branches into the coronary arteries, which supply the heart muscle with blood, the carotid arteries, which supply the head or brain area, the hepatic arteries, which supply the liver, renal arteries, which supply the kidneys, and the mesenteric arteries, which supply the intestines. Pulmonary artery carries oxygen, poor blood to the lungs. Arteries branch into smaller arteries. Arteries branch into smaller arteries and then into arterioles. Arterioles are the smallest arteries in the body. Arterioles branch into a series of increasingly smaller vessels until they connect to the capillaries. The pulse. The pulse is palpated most easily at the neck, the wrist, or groin. So the pulse is an indicator of how well the heart is beating, and there are various pulse points that we can utilize on the patient, but it has to be an area. The best area is going to be where that pulse runs over a rigid surface. It is created by forceful pumping of blood out of the left ventricle and into the major arteries. Now, on this particular slide, you don't need to know all of these arteries right off the bat. It's going to take time to become familiar with them, but definitely some major ones that you need to be familiar with would be the carotid, the brachial, radial, femoral, popliteal, dorsalis pedis, right? So, and over time, you're going to learn those because we're going to be using them a lot in our practice. Once you have completed the course, continue to learn your anatomy. Now, capillaries connect arteries to arterioles to venules. Fine end division of arterial system allow contact between blood and cells. Veins return oxygen depleted blood to the heart. The superior vena cava carries blood returning from the head, neck, shoulders, and upper extremities. The inferior vena cava carries blood from the abdomen, pelvis, and lower extremities and join at the right atrium. Now, the spleen. The spleen has a role to play in immune system, and it has a role to play in the circulation as well. So it's a solid organ located under the rib cage, and its main role is to filter blood. So what the spleen is able to do, it's able to detect old cells, old red blood cells, and damaged red blood cells, and it is able to break these cells down. So it will break them down and then take components from them that are useful, like iron. Now, the spleen also helps to regulate the amount of blood that is circulating within the body, and it stores a certain amount of blood in case the body goes into shock as a result of severe blood loss. It is highly susceptible to blunt force trauma to the chest and upper abdomen, right? So blunt force trauma to the lower portion of the chest and upper abdomen can cause spleen damage. Now, the blood composition, the blood is composed of plasma, which is a liquid portion, red blood cells, erythrocytes, which are important to the process of oxygenation. They require 4 oxygen molecules to be properly oxygenated. The red blood cells cannot move on their own, so they need fluid to transport them. White blood cells are your leukocytes, and they are important to fighting infection and the immune response or inflammatory response. The white blood cells are able to move to wherever there is a problem in the body. Platelets are important to the clotting process. Now, the circulatory system physiology, the blood pressure, which is based on cardiac output, which is heart rate times stroke volume, how fast the heart is beating times the amount of blood being injected with each beat. So the blood pressure, the pressure that blood exerts against the wall of the arteries. And there are 2 phases to the blood pressure. You have what is referred to as the systolic phase and the diastolic phase. And blood pressure is written as a fraction. So let me put in a text here. 120 over 80. All right, let me enlarge this. All right, so blood pressure is written as a fraction. 120 over 80, the top number represents the systolic reading or systole, and the bottom number represents diastole. So 120 would be systolic and 80 would be the diastolic. Now, when the left ventricle of the heart contracts, it pumps blood from the ventricles into the aorta. In other words, the systolic reading is obtained when the ventricles contract and push blood out. The diastolic reading is obtained when the ventricles relax, right? So there is 2 types of pressure created when the heart is about to contract. There is something that is referred to as preload, and there is something that is referred to as afterload. Now, the preload pressure is created when the heart stretches and fills up with blood. That's the pressure that is built up before the heart contracts. That's the preload pressure. The afterload pressure is when the heart contracts and the blood is now in the aorta or arteries. There is a pressure that the blood must flow against in the arteries. That is called the afterload pressure. And these are the 2 pressures that will give us a blood pressure. Now, if you subtract the diastolic from the systolic pressure, that will give us what is called the pulse pressure, which is not a pulse rate. The pulse pressure represents the strength of cardiac contraction. We will discuss it further when we cover shock. Now, blood pressure reading, systolic blood pressure, high point of the wave. Not important to remember that. What is important to remember is Systolic blood pressure is when the ventricle contracts. Diastolic blood pressure is when the ventricles are relaxing. So you want to learn the high point of the wave and low point of the wave, go ahead. I like to keep things simple. All right, now normal circulation in adults. Now, the blood pressure, we need a blood pressure within the body that is capable of supplying the core organs and the rest of the body. And when I say core organs, I'm talking about the brain, the lungs, the heart, the kidneys. These are very important core organs. So we need a pressure that is able to supply the core organs and the rest of the body based on our daily activities, right? So what the body does is it adjusts the diameter of the blood vessels in different areas of the body to maintain a pressure that is sufficient to do whatever task an individual is carrying out. Now, what does that mean? It means that if an individual is lying down, their blood pressure will not be the same if they are sitting upright, standing, walking, running, exercising. So the blood pressure adjusts based on the activity. So normal circulation in adults, automatically adjusted and controlled. The goal is perfusion. That is the main goal, perfusion. Now, when we talk about perfusion, perfusion is the exchange of oxygen and nutrients and the removal of carbon dioxide and waste from the cells within the body, right? So the cells need oxygen and glucose to produce energy. Once they have oxygen and glucose, they can produce the amount of energy that is required to metabolize or carry out their normal function. Once they have enough oxygen and glucose, this is referred to as aerobic metabolism. So aerobic metabolism is what the cells want. This is going to give them the right energy production. And that is the process of perfusion. Now, if there is not enough oxygen specifically and or glucose available, the energy production will be significantly decreased, right? The energy production will be significantly decreased and less energy is available to metabolize. If less oxygen or no oxygen is available, that is referred to as anaerobic. All right. Somebody has their mic on. All right, someone asked to repeat perfusion. Okay. Perfusion is the exchange of oxygen and nutrients, right? So it's the exchange of oxygen and nutrients and the removal of carbon dioxide and waste from the cells within the body so that they can carry out their normal metabolic function. And in order for that to be effective, we must have adequate circulation and the blood must be properly oxygenated and all the nutrients that are required must be in the blood and the body must be able to remove the CO2 and the waste effectively. Now, blood enters organs and tissues through arteries. Blood leaves organs and tissues through the veins. Now let's look at inadequate circulation in adults. The system can adjust to small blood loss, right? So if there's blood loss occurring, the vessels can constrict to increase pressure if the cardiac output is low, right? So if the blood pressure falls within the body, the first thing the body is going to do is constrict the blood vessels to increase pressure and increase the pumping action of the heart. But if there's a large amount of blood loss, the compensating mechanism might not work, and the patient will eventually go into shock. And when you see the term shock, it means low perfusion or hypoperfusion. Now, functions of the blood. The blood has a role to play in perfusion, transporting oxygen, transporting carbon dioxide, transporting waste and nutrients, and clotting, coagulation. All right, now let's look at the nervous system control of the cardiovascular system. So the heart is very unique. It's a very unique organ, right? Very unique. The heart does need the brain to regulate itself, right? So the heart muscle has intrinsic properties, right? It can generate its own electrical current. It can increase the strength of its contraction, right? It can increase the rate of its contraction. It can do these things intrinsically. However, there are situations where the nervous system must intervene, right? So there are situations in which the nervous system may have to step in and regulate, right? So that portion of the nervous system would be referred to as the sympathetic nervous system, and it is responsible for fight or flight response. And it sends commands to the adrenal gland, right? And so in your fight or flight response, the sympathetic nervous system is going to activate, right? So if you start to get nervous when you're being tested, that's a sympathetic. If you're nervous or anxious when you're going on your first call, sympathetic activating right there. If you're involved in a confrontation, fight, and you're making a decision to fight or run away, it's going to be a sympathetic nervous system that is regulating the heart at that point. Now, this is how it works. So when the adrenal glands are stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system, they will produce epinephrine or adrenaline. So some people know it as epinephrine, some know it as adrenaline, and it will produce norepinephrine or noradrenaline, right? So these are secreted to stimulate the heart and the blood vessels. Not gonna go too deep into it now. What you need to understand is that when there is a drop in blood pressure, the first place in the body that is going to realize that something is wrong is the kidneys. When that occurs, the sympathetic nervous system is activated and it stimulates the adrenal glands. The adrenal gland will then produce norepinephrine or noradrenaline first. So that's the first one that comes out. Norepinephrine, noradrenaline. When norepinephrine or noradrenaline comes out, it acts heavily on the blood vessels. So it stimulates the blood vessels. When the blood vessels are stimulated, they constrict, and that increases the pressure inside the blood vessels. Now, once that occurs, then the body will produce adrenaline or epinephrine. When epinephrine or adrenaline comes out, it will stimulate the heart muscle. itself. So when adrenaline and epinephrine comes out, or epinephrine comes out, it stimulates the heart muscle and it stimulates the ear passage, right? So it's two things adrenaline will do, and it can have some effects on the blood vessels, but primarily it's going to stimulate the heart and increase all the functions of the heart. It's going to increase the rate of contraction, the rate of electrical conduction, and the strength of contraction. When epinephrine or adrenaline stimulates the ear passage, it causes the ear passage to open up so that more air can come into the lungs containing oxygen. And as I say, I'm going to go deeper into that down the line. All right, now the blood vessels have alpha adrenergic receptors, right? Now, receptors are protein sites within the cells or vessels that can be stimulated to create a specific reaction. So the blood vessels have alpha adrenergic receptors. And these are the receptors that noradrenaline or norepinephrine will affect. The heart and lungs have what is referred to as beta adrenergic receptors, right? Beta adrenergic receptors. And these are the receptors that will be heavily stimulated by epinephrine or adrenaline. Now, there is a counter system to the sympathetic system. So you have the sympathetic response, which is fight or flight, and you have the parasympathetic response, which is the rest and digest part of the nervous system. So when you go on lunch and eat, and you come back to class and you start getting sleepy because all the blood is being directed to your intestine, unless blood is going up to the brain, that's your parasympathetic system, rest and digest. When we go to sleep at night, that's parasympathetic. So it's going to slow down the brain function, it's going to slow down breathing, it's going to slow down the heart rate. So the parasympathetic nervous system also has effects on the cardiovascular system. It addresses actions that do not require an immediate response. Make sure you understand that. So if an immediate response is needed, it's going to be the sympathetic. If it's an action that don't require an immediate response, the parasympathetic will be the one that is activated. All right. Now, before we go to the nervous system, any questions? Okay. All right. So let's move on to the nervous system, anatomy and physiology. The nervous system is perhaps the most complex organ in the body. Very complex. It is divided into two main portions. You have the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and you have the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral means away from. And the peripheral nervous system consists of the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. And you have 12 pairs of cranial nerves, 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And no, you are not required to know them for this course. However, if you decide to go higher up in your studies as an advanced or paramedic, then you will be expected to know them. Now, let's look at the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So the brain is the controlling organ of the body, and the subdivisions of the brain are the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. So these are three main areas of the brain that you need to be familiar with at your level. The cerebrum is the largest portion of the brain, and it is responsible for all the functions within our body that requires conscious thoughts. Right? So all the functions that require conscious thoughts are the cerebrum. The cerebellum, which is often referred to as the midbrain, right, is smaller than the cerebrum but larger than the brainstem. And the cerebellum, you will use the B and L in cerebellum to remember balance and coordinated movement. So that's the role of the cerebellum. It is responsible for balance and coordinated movement. Then you have the brainstem, which is the smallest area of the brain and one of the most well protected areas of the brain because it is responsible for all life-sustaining functions. So we're talking about the ability to breathe, the heart rate regulation, sleeping, eating. That's the brainstem. Now, the spinal cord is the connection to the brain and the rest of the body. So as it exits the foramen magnum, there are nerves that branch out in the upper extremities and lower extremities, and signals can be relayed from the brain to these areas. So the spinal cord is an extension of the brainstem. It transmits messages between the brain and body. Now let's look at the peripheral. Let me backtrack a bit. Yeah, let's look at the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is away from the central nervous system, and there are two components to the peripheral system. Peripheral nervous system, you have the somatic nervous system, which is responsible for voluntary functions, and you have the autonomic nervous system, which is responsible for involuntary function. Now, when you see the term voluntary, it means that the brain needs to directly control that action. That's what voluntary means. When you see the term involuntary, it means that the brain doesn't have to directly control that action. Now, the autonomic nervous system will eventually break down into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, which we discussed previously, right? So it will eventually break down to that. Now, the somatic nervous system transmits signals from the brain to the voluntary muscles. So the somatic nervous system is heavily influenced by the spinal nerves, and its primary role is coordinated movement of the limbs of the body. The autonomic nervous system is heavily influenced by the cranial nerves, right? So it's heavily influenced by the cranial nerves and hormones being produced in specific areas of the body. So the functions tend to be more internal and they tend to be more involuntary, right? So the autonomic nervous system is responsible for involuntary actions, and it splits into two areas: the sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight, and the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest or feed and breathe system. Now, question. So let's see if you were paying attention. What is the role of the sympathetic nervous system if the blood pressure is too low in the body? So the questions are becoming more complex now. What is the role of the sympathetic nervous system if the blood pressure is too low in the body? Who can answer that question? Go ahead, Mr. Graham.
Yes, sir. The sympathetic nervous system will produce hormones to stimulate the heart muscles.
Only the heart muscles?
Not the heart muscles, but also the lungs as well, because the
Okay,
heart and the lungs work together in like pumping blood, right?
right. So what about the vessels?
Also the vessels, yes.
Okay, all right, good. That's good enough. So the role of the sympathetic, if the blood pressure is not sufficient, is to produce hormones, adrenaline and norepinephrine, right? Or epinephrine and norepinephrine, or adrenaline and noradrenaline. It also produces endorphin. So it's not just adrenaline and noradrenaline, it produces endorphin as well. And basically, endorphin is endo mean inside, orphan is a short version of the word morphine. And morphine is a narcotic pain medication. So when we're injured, our body produces endorphin to decrease the amount of pain that we're having. But as soon as that endorphin wears off, then the pain gets quite intense. And if we're all active, well, if we were all active in our young days, we would have experienced this, right? We're playing football, you get a rough tackle, and you're not feeling much discomfort. Or you go to training, you do a sparring session, you get a injury, not feeling much discomfort. The endorphin is being produced at that point. But when you go home and the endorphin wears off and you wake up in the morning, you can barely move that limb with the amount of pain and discomfort that is occurring. So the sympathetic nervous system also produces endorphin. Now, what would be the role of well, the answer is there, so let me not ask. The answer is there. All right, two types of nerves within the peripheral nervous system that you need to be familiar with is your sensory and your motor nerves. The sensory nerves carry information from the body to the brain. So it picks up information in the environment and relay that message to the brain. The motor nerves carry information from the brain to the muscles. And I think that would be it for now on the nervous system. There is more, but we will keep it at that until we go into head and spine injury and neurologic emergencies. So we're keeping it simple for now. Keeping it simple. All right, now the integumentary system, or the skin anatomy. Gonna be very short for this one. So there are two main layers, and the skin is the largest organ in the body. There are two layers that you need to be familiar with: the epidermal layer, which is the top layer or superficial layer, and the dermal or dermis, which is deeper. And of course, you have the subcutaneous tissue, which lies beneath that, right? Which there's a lot of fat present for insulation, and it's a source of energy as well if the body is getting desperate. The dermis is where we will find most of the blood vessels and nerve endings for the skin. And the skin has multiple functions. It acts as a sense organ, so it picks up changes in the environment and relay that to the brain. It can play a role in temperature regulation. It protects the body from invading organisms, and it has a role to play in water regulation or the regulation of plasma within the body. And there's a diagram. No. So the skin is the largest single organ in the body. Three major functions that you need to be familiar with as an EMT. It protects the body in the environment. It regulates the body temperatures. It transmits information from the environment to the brain. All right, now let's look at the digestive system. Let me plug this up. Digestion is the process of food, the processing of food that nourishes the cells. The abdomen is the second major body cavity, and it contains major organs of digestion and excretion. And we learned in the beginning of I think it was medical terminology, that the abdomen is divided into 4 quadrants: right upper, right lower, left upper, left lower. And there are specific organs in each of these quadrants, whether it's a solid organ or a hollow organ, right? So you have your 4 quadrants, and as we progress in the course, you need to know what is in the right, what is in the left, what is in the right lower, what is in the left lower. So the mouth: lips, cheeks, gums, teeth, tongue, and salivary glands. So the digestion of food starts with the food being broken down, right? So we chew the food, and then it passes down the esophagus into the stomach, where chemicals act on it, or acids, to get it to a semi-liquid state, and then it is passed through the small intestine, where nutrients and water is absorbed. Then it enters the large intestine, where the remaining water is removed, and then it forms the stool and go down to the rectum. Right? So you have the oropharynx, which is the posterior portion of the mouth, esophagus, which connects to the stomach, and you have the pancreas, which plays a role in digestion and also how the body regulates glucose. The liver produces bile, which is important to breaking down fats. The small intestine, as I mentioned before, this is where majority of the nutrients and water, or what the body needs, will be absorbed. And then it goes down to the large intestine, where the remaining fluid is removed and it becomes more formed stool that passes down to the rectum, and then we remove it. Now, when we cover what's that, gastrointestinal emergencies, I will go deeper into the digestive system. For now, this is enough. And really, what I want you guys to focus on is the 4 fundamental systems, right? Make sure you know those systems very well before we go into next week. So the musculoskeletal system, the respiratory, cardiovascular, and the nervous system. Just know the basics for the other systems. But I can tell you now, majority of the questions will come from the four major ones that I've mentioned. Now, enzymes are added to food by salivary glands, the stomach, the liver, pancreas, and the small intestine. Foods is converted into basic sugars, fatty acids, and amino acid, and then it is further processed by the liver and circulated via the blood to the rest of the body. All right, now lymphatic system, not going to spend a lot of time on this either. What you need to know about the lymphatic system is it runs closely alongside the circulatory system. And the role of the lymphatic system is to pick up fluid that is being pushed out from the arterial side. So it picks up any fluid that is pushed out on the arterial side and then filters that fluid. So it filters it. So as it passes through the lymphatic system, there are checkpoints that is going to check the fluid for bacteria or invading organisms and deal with them. Once it ensures that the fluid is clean, it then passes that fluid back into the low pressure side, which will be the venous side of the circulatory system. So the elements of the lymphatic system include the spleen, the lymph nodes, lymph vessels, thymus gland, and other components. It supports the circulatory system and the immune system. Lymph is a thin, straw-colored fluid that carries oxygen and nutrients to the cell and waste products away. It helps to rid the body of toxins and other harmful materials. And that's the lymphatic system. That's what you need to know for now. The endocrine system, anatomy and physiology, is a complex message and control system. It integrates many body functions, and hormones are released directly into the bloodstream. Endo, so you have endocrine glands and you have exocrine, right? Endo is into the blood, exo is via duct, but the focus for this course will be more on the endocrine production. So we talked about epinephrine, we talked about norepinephrine, and of course, you're gonna have to be familiar with insulin. So epinephrine, when produced, will affect beta receptors that are found in the heart and lungs. It can have some effects on the blood vessels, but not significant effects. When epinephrine or adrenaline is produced, it stimulates the heart, it increases all the functions of the heart. The rate of contraction, the strength of contraction, the rate of electrical conduction. And when epinephrine or adrenaline is produced and it stimulates the air passage, it will open up the airway so that more air containing oxygen can enter the lungs. When norepinephrine or noradrenaline is produced, it will act on alpha receptors in the blood vessels. When alpha receptors are stimulated, it will cause the blood vessels to constrict, and that will increase the pressure inside the blood vessels. Now, insulin is produced by the pancreas via the islets of Langerhans, right? Now, the role of insulin is to, the main role for now is to allow the entry of glucose into the cell. So it acts as a facilitator. It's a key that opens the door to the cell so that glucose can enter the cell. The other thing that insulin does, so when there's too much sugar in the blood, insulin will be produced and it can also store. So it converts excess sugar to glycogen, and that is stored in the liver. So that's insulin for now. Now, even though the cells in the body require insulin in order to utilize glucose, there is one area in the body in which insulin is not required for that purpose. So the brain cells do not require insulin to get sugar. They can get sugar directly, right? So it's the only cell in the body that doesn't need insulin, because the brain cannot go without sugar for a very long time, right? Immediately, if the blood sugar to the brain is low, the patient will start to present with issues. So that's that for now. Now, the brain controls the release of hormones, right? Excess or deficiencies in hormones can lead to disease. I have various glands. Not gonna go through what each gland is responsible for. That's not required for this course. If you desire to do additional reading on that, feel free, but I'm not gonna expect you to know all the function of these glands. Certainly not at an EMT level, not right off the bat. But if you're doing your AEMT or paramedic or higher, then all of this will become important. Some of these glands we will cover as the course progress, not all of them, but definitely the adrenal gland, the pancreas, ovaries for sure. Yeah. All right, now the urinary system. The urinary system anatomy and physiology. It controls the discharge of certain waste materials filtered from the blood by the kidneys. It controls fluid balance in the body, and it filters and eliminates waste and controls the pH. And pH represents the power of hydrogen. The more hydrogen we have in the body, the more acidic the environment becomes. The less hydrogen we have, the less acidic. So that's what pH represents. So the urinary system is like the toilet of the body, right? It's the toilet of the body. It's responsible for filtering out waste material and absorbing useful stuff that the body is going to need. Now, just like the toilet at our home, if there's not enough water in the toilet, it can't flush. So water is essential to the kidneys, right? All right, and there's a diagram of that. All right, and we will cover this for sure in more details down the line when we start to look at the specific emergencies. All right, the genital system, anatomy and physiology, controls reproductive process. And that's the main function of the reproductive system, reproduction. I have the male system, which consists of the testicles, epididymis, vasa differentia, prostate gland, seminal vesicles, and the penis. We will go through the functions of these further down in the course. It's not required right now, but I will cover the function or the role of all of these down the line. Right. Now, the female system consists of the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, the uterus, the cervix, and the vagina, right? And again, all of this information, all of the roles and function of these structures will be covered in the emergency chapters, not required for this portion of the course. Wanted to focus on the 4 core organs and anything that I've emphasized thus far. Right? So you have the ovaries, which are going to produce the eggs, right? And you will eventually move down the fallopian tube and implant in the wall of the uterus if it is fertilized by a sperm. If not, eventually it will break down. As I said, we're gonna discuss that further down in the course when we do obstetric emergencies. All right, now the life support chain. The life support chain. All cells in the body require oxygen, nutrients, and the removal of waste. So every cell in the body requires that. The circulatory system is the carrier of these supplies and waste. And remember, once we start to talk about the exchange of oxygen, nutrients, and the removal of waste and CO2, we're talking about perfusion, right? This is perfusion. If interference occurs, cells become damaged and die. Cells use oxygen to turn nutrients into chemical energy through metabolism. And when that occurs, we get adenosine triphosphate, right, which is used to store energy. Once we have enough oxygen available, enough energy will be produced to be stored for metabolism. And once oxygen is involved in metabolism, it is referred to as aerobic metabolism. Now, cells will switch to anaerobic metabolism when there is no oxygen available. And a byproduct of that is going to be lactic acid, which is a damaging waste product. So if the body starts to produce lactic acid, it can damage the cells in the body. And remember, if it's acidic, it means that there is too much hydrogen, right? So cells cannot function in an acidic environment. It can actually cause the brain to shut down and the patient goes into a coma. So if the body is too acidic, the brain shuts down. If the body is too alkalotic, there is overstimulation. There's too much stimulation taking place, and that patient can also go unresponsive because it can cause significant stress on the heart. So an acidic environment is not good, and an alkalotic environment is not good. We need something that's more neutral, 7.35 to 7.45 pH. Movement of oxygen, waste, and nutrients occur by diffusion, and we are very familiar with diffusion at this stage. Go ahead, Mr. Graham.
Oh, yes, sir. In the previous sessions where we talk about muscles, the
Yes.
musculoskeletal system, I figured the one time you mentioned that the abnormal movement of muscles also produce lactic acid, right?
No.
Did you mention
Yes,
that?
yes. Abnormal. Abnormal.
Abnormal,
Yes.
abnormal. Okay.
That is correct.
Okay.
So if it's normal muscle contraction, you'll get heat. If it's abnormal, then we can get lactic acid. And usually at that stage, it means that the oxygen reserves in the muscle is depleted. Right? You see it in fighters when they get exhausted in a fight where the limbs get heavy and their movement becomes very sluggish. They want to move, but the muscles won't work as how it should. So that would be correct. Any other question before I continue? Go ahead, Mr. Thomas. Go ahead, Mr. Thomas. Do you have a question? Not sure what's going on there. All right, moving right along. All right, so the movement of oxygen, waste, and nutrients occurs by diffusion. pH is critical to diffusion. Again, pH represents the power of hydrogen. We have too much hydrogen in the body becomes acidic, right? The environment becomes acidic, that's acidity. If there is less or a depletion of hydrogen ions in the body, then that will lead to alkalinity. Both are bad. So acidity shuts down the brain, alkalinity leads to overstimulation, which can affect the heart. So we don't want any of the two. The body expends a large amount of energy to maintain normal pH. Very important, right? Very important. Now, pathophysiology, the study of functional changes that occur when the body reacts to disease, right? So these are the abnormal functions. This is what you will see when the patient is having a problem. So respiratory compromise is the inability of the body to move gas effectively. And when we covered the respiratory system, we looked at gas exchange, which is respiration. So if the body is not able to move gas effectively, it means there will be a depletion of oxygen and an increase in carbon dioxide. So if oxygen levels are depleted or become low, that is referred to as hypoxia, low oxygen. And once there's hypoxia occurring, the brain function will be affected and other systems in the body can be affected. If there is too much carbon dioxide in the body, that is referred to as hypercarbia. Now, if there's a buildup of too much carbon dioxide in the body, carbon dioxide will eventually combine with water to form what we call carbonic acid. And as carbonic acid builds up in the body, the pH is going to become more acidic. And what happens to the brain? If the environment is too acidic, the brain shuts down. Right. Now, factors that can impair ventilation, a blocked airway. Right? So And when you're thinking about a patient's airway being obstructed or blocked, the first thing you will consider is the tongue. So think about the tongue obstructing the airway. That's the first thing we need to rule in or rule out. There are other things that can cause problems. It can be a foreign body, it can be fluid, it can be internal. So the patient is having an asthma attack or an allergic reaction and the airway starts to constrict, right? It can be other factors. It can be positional. The patient is involved in a motor vehicle accident and something is pinning the chest down so the chest cannot move, right? There can be, so that's factors affecting ventilation. Let's look at factors affecting respiration. So changes in the atmosphere can alter how the exchange of oxygen occurs in the body. High altitude, right? So as we go up, all right, excuse me for a minute. All right, sorry about that. We will get a break shortly because the chapter is almost finished. If you need to take a break, go ahead. The lecture is being recorded. So if you miss part of it, you can catch wherever you miss. Now, factors that impair respiration: changes in atmosphere, changes in altitude, impaired movement of gas across the cell membrane. So the higher we go, there's less oxygen available in the ear, and pressure changes can make it difficult for the oxygen to move into the lungs. All right, now VQ ratio. A VQ ratio, what does that mean? VQ ratio is ventilation perfusion ratio. Now what that means is at the point that oxygen reaches the alveoli, deoxygenated blood must be present in the pulmonary capillaries for the exchange to occur. If the blood reaches the pulmonary capillaries and there is no oxygen available, then the blood is going to be returned to the left side with no oxygen. So it has to be balanced. And if it's not balanced, then we get a ventilation perfusion mismatch. So how much gas is being moved effectively through the lungs? How much blood is flowing around the alveoli where perfusion occurs? And as I said, if the blood reaches the pulmonary capillaries and oxygen is not available, then we get a mismatch and the blood is recirculated to the heart without any oxygen in it. And that can lead to serious complications. Effects of respiratory compromise on the body. Oxygen levels fall and carbon dioxide level rise. The respiratory rate will increase. The blood becomes more acidic and the brain send commands to the body to breathe. Who was that with their hand up? Go ahead. Was that an accident or you have a question?
No, I wanted to repeat the slides before.
Which slide?
Yeah, before that. Yeah, that's it, sir.
This one?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. So we're going to take a break now. Going to take a break and we will resume at 10:40.